To the August Recess Toolkit, what GFOA members need to know. I'm Emily Brock, and I'm part of a larger team representing you in Washington, D.C. And as you may know, GFOA has a strong presence in Washington, D.C., representing you. We represent you in issues like sales tax and federal preemption efforts, in the preservation of the municipal bond tax exemption and the use of municipal bonds generally and in infrastructure. We represent you on tracking grants and grant implementation on things like ARPA and IIJA and many other federal grant processes that are happening presently at a very rapid clip. And last but not least, we represent you on retirement and healthcare security issues in Washington, D.C. And if you're watching this, it's likely that you might be interested in some of this advocacy as well and participating in this advocacy. Now's a great time to do that. August happens to be a period of time where members of Congress tend to go back into their districts to spend time with their constituents, to be at home even, to recalibrate and re-understand what it is they do to represent you in Washington, D.C. So now's a great time for you to make contact with your congressional legislators. And on the next slide, now's a great time for you to do that. So that's what we're going to do here today in this webinar. First of all, we're going to walk you through some of the issues. What are the issues of the day, of the minute, of the hour? What are those issues that we have as a priority as GFOA that are longstanding? We're going to give you talking points and some general ideas on how to approach your members of Congress. And last but not least, we're going to give you a toolkit so that you can also do that outreach on your own. And we're here, as always, to be support for you. If you do reach out to them, if you need a letter, if you have a phone call, we are here with talking points for you, and we're very happy to do that. So thanks so much for watching this Toolkit webinar. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Michael Bellarmino.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you all for joining us and checking out our August Recess Toolkit. So on the next slide, you'll see that we actually found, this is actually a pretty perfect and humorous take on what we're talking to you about today. And as Emily mentioned, the August recess. Now, there are a number of points throughout the year that one or both chambers are actually in recess. But as Emily mentioned, August is typically the more notable one, and sometimes it's the longest. But there was actually even a time, though, when it was more like a summer recess because Congress actually would be able to complete their budget appropriations work in June. Imagine that, we actually saw that again, but we'll touch on that in a moment. But at the time of this recording, the House has already recessed, but the Senate is actually going to be in for a few more days, which is par for the course, is typically what happens. The Senate will be in for a few days at the beginning of August. But as the cartoon depicts, it doesn't always feel like there's a difference between when they are in session or not. And you might wonder, why is that so? Well, unfortunately, over the past decade or so, there has been a growing trend that, in particular, major pieces of legislation, unless it's some sort of national emergency, they usually can only enact those during the first early months of the first session of a Congress, because there's just a lot of momentum. It's after the election, or as part of some massive omnibus bill that members will generally just vote for, and they'll argue that there are more good parts of the bill than there were bad. Really, just another way to say that, well, no one got everything that they wanted, but someone or everybody actually gets something out of the bill. So other than that, most of the bills that they do take up are fairly mundane in nature during the regular course of events throughout the year. Now, we generally pride ourselves in pursuing bipartisan legislation, and that honestly is still a good thing, but it really meant more in the past, whereas nowadays, even having bipartisan support, strong bipartisan support at times, doesn't actually guarantee that you'll be able to advance legislation the way it really should. But really, again, just a little bit of humor just to get us started here. But let's go ahead and jump into what's happening on Capitol Hill right now. So where we are, you'll see on this slide, there's a couple of big ticket markers on where Congress sits on a few issues. Now, as you know, we are in the last 6 months of the second session of the 117th Congress, which means any legislation that is not passed by December 31st of this year has to start the process all over again. So think of that old Schoolhouse Rock video of just a bill sitting on Capitol Hill. Well, if you don't get past the finish line of actually passing both chambers, then you're going to have to go back to being that bill sitting on the steps of Capitol Hill again. Now, we are also less than 2 months before the start of the next federal fiscal year. So that means if Congress doesn't complete the budget appropriations process before October 1, we could be in for some turbulence in a few weeks, and we'll touch on that in a moment as well. Now, not to mention that, as many of you are pretty aware at this point because of all the news coverage of the various primaries going on over the last couple of weeks, it's an election year. And since the balance of power in Congress is up for grabs, all the members who are up for re-election, that's all 435 in the House and a third in the Senate, they're going to want to spend as much time as possible on the campaign trail before November. So with just these three factors alone, they're already exerting some intense pressure on an already limited legislative calendar. But even though we still, we'll power through all that nonetheless, but even though we still have to do that, we're also already looking ahead to what needs to be done at the start of the 118th Congress. So of course, we're already going to be thinking about setting up freshman meetings, as well as trying to expand that municipal finance caucus in the House. Now, we've also had some third rail issues raise their heads recently. Now, you know that Congress, if you've been following over the past few months, they did manage to pass some gun control reform, although after July 4th, in particular with a number of the shootings like the one that unfortunately happened in Chicago, some members of Congress still want to do even more. The House actually just took up and passed their assault weapons ban. It's unclear when or if the Senate will even take that bill up for consideration. And of course, given the recent Supreme Court rulings, like the case that overturned Roe v. Wade, there are some in the Democratic Party that acknowledge it's time now to try to act on some of these issues because they're going to be potentially seeing a change in power in Congress once we get into the new year. I mean, just this week, a bipartisan group of senators introduced legislation codifying Roe v. Wade, and we even saw on Tuesday night that there was a pretty notable ballot measure that was on in the state of Kansas. So we know this is probably going to play, have some play in the next couple of weeks as well. Then, of course, with respect to implementation and regulation, aside from IIJA, which you'll hear about later, we are still actively engaging Treasury on the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. Now, we just passed a reporting deadline a couple of days ago, so hopefully it wasn't any more painful than previous deadlines for those of you who actually had to report. But we're also engaging agencies like the SEC and MSRB as they start to look at issues that could potentially impact the municipal market. Now, moving on, one of the biggest questions that we had as we were moving into the summer, and especially as we were approaching the end of the 117th, was, are we ever going to build back better? Or are we going to build back never? Now, as you may recall, this is that major social spending package that was introduced last year, and that was intended to be that next item, the big ticket item on the Biden administration's wish list that they hope to enact given unified control of Congress and the White House. Now, the House managed to pass a pared-down version of the original package, but still included some infrastructure-related investments. But that initial effort was ultimately tanked by Senators Manchin and Sinema towards the end of last year. But if you've been paying attention to some of the Beltway headlines in recent days, there was a bit of a breakthrough with a deal announced between Leader Schumer and Senator Manchin. Now, the process is continuing as we speak right now. Leader Schumer did announce, though, that he plans to have a vote sometime this week before the Senate recesses. But before we talk about the process, let's talk about what's currently part of the deal. Now, it's actually, compared to what it started out as, it's not much. Now, all the stuff that you see on that left side of your screen, it's much more pared down than what they originally proposed. And so It's really just a pared down version of a climate/healthcare/tax policy bill. On the climate side, although it's not as much as some had hoped for, it's a victory nonetheless in the eyes of some climate activists, because among other provisions that were currently included are a variety of rebates and credits to help consumers with rising energy costs, tax credits and grants to help businesses to reduce their emissions, and then environmental justice grants to benefit disadvantaged communities. On the healthcare side, we already knew that prescription drug pricing reform was something that Senator Manchin was really holding up as one of the priorities that he wanted to address. Now, among the provisions that are included there are the ability of Medicare to begin negotiating directly for the price of prescription drugs in 2023, capping out-of-pocket costs for Medicare patients, and then providing incentives for manufacturers and insurers to keep drug prices down. And then finally, on the tax policy side, initially Democrats really wanted to get almost 40 some odd tax provisions included, but we really ended up just getting two main components, at least in the deal that was announced recently. The first was just a funding boost for the IRS to help with tax enforcement and compliance. Right now, they're estimating that just investing $80 billion over 10 years into the IRS will actually result in the collection of over $200 billion. And then, of course, something that you've probably heard about a lot in the headlines is the inclusion of the corporate minimum tax. This provision would impose a 15% minimum tax on adjusted financial statement income for corporations with profits in excess of $1 billion. Now, they haven't released just yet the full text of the bill, or they actually have released a draft, but one of the things that we are waiting on is to see what the Senate parliamentarian is going to rule on the various provisions in the bill. But before I get to that, what's not in the bill, unfortunately, at this point, despite being included in a prior House-passed version or iteration of the Build Back Better plan, is some priorities that are important to GFOA, and that's advanced refunding and bank qualified. But we'll get to that in a moment as well. The other thing that's not in the bill is the much talked about repeal of the SALT deduction. As you know, that this was potentially a third rail issue that has been around, of course, since the 2017 tax reform bill. Now, despite some Democrats threatening to not support any version of a Build Back Better bill if a SALT cap repeal was not included, it does seem like that they're starting to coalesce and trying to get this bill across the finish line. Although we'll see what happens in the coming days, but we know even Senator Menendez out of New Jersey, in somewhat of a rebuke to his West Virginia colleague, and maybe even a little bit of a veiled threat that anybody can be Joe Manchin nowadays. He said that, of course, in response to the SALT cap repeal not being included in the bill. But as I said, the process is still continuing, and there are hurdles that remain. One of the big ones is we don't know where Senator Sinema is right now. As I mentioned, Senators Sinema and Manchin tanked the effort last time. Now we know Senator Manchin is on board, but we still don't know where Senator Sinema stands. And we likely may not know until they actually get to the floor. The other hurdle, or another hurdle, is actually by using reconciliation, a process we've talked about in previous presentations, but we won't really go into depth today. Democrats can actually bypass, Republican support entirely, but they also must adhere to strict budgetary rules that restrict the scope and structure of the bill. One major condition, of course, named the Byrd Rule after the architect, Senator Robert Byrd, coincidentally out of West Virginia, formerly out of West Virginia, includes a ban on any provision in the bill that does not directly change revenue or spending. So currently, the Senate parliamentarian is reviewing and scrubbing every provision and language in the bill, and we're awaiting her rulings on that. Yet another hurdle is senators have to endure, because of the reconciliation process, they have to endure 20 hours of debate and then the infamous vote-a-rama after, where any senator can offer any proposal with no time limit. And Senate Republicans are already threatening to make this a very painful process and trying to get Democrats to be on the record for some very painful votes with the amendments that they're planning to introduce. And yet another hurdle is because the Senate rules do not allow for proxy voting, every senator has to be present. And because we are currently at a 50-50 split, that means neither side can afford to lose or to lose anyone, especially if COVID protocols have to kick in. Now, notably this week right now, Senator Durbin recently was able to come out of the protocols and out of isolation, but Senator Cornyn recently tested positive. And so right now they're watching and of course, making sure, because when the vote happens, every senator has to be present. And of course, the vice president would be voting to break the tie. And then, of course, the final hurdle, even if the Senate does pass the legislation, the House still needs to act. They're already out on recess, but Speaker Pelosi has already said that if the House or the Senate does pass this bill, she would call the House back within 24 hours notice so that they can, take the bill up quickly. Certainly more to come, but the FOC will be sure to provide updates as they occur in the coming days. Now, looking at the next slide real quick, there is a question of whether we might have a government shutdown in a couple of months. Now, keep in mind, we already started with a delayed process as the FY22 funding was not completed until nearly 6 months after the fiscal year, so early March. So the normal process you see on the screen already had a late start. The House has already passed 6 of 12 appropriations bills. It's uncertain if the remainder will be taken up in September, but that's just the House side. It's unclear what the Senate, if they're going to actually do anything in September on the bills, on the appropriations bills. Ideally, both chambers would pass their respective appropriations bills before September, because that would at least give 3 weeks to iron out the differences. But since the Senate has yet to act on any of theirs, as we approach the October 1 deadline, we face one of 3 possible scenarios. A potential shutdown, of course, because the federal government technically would run out of money because it hasn't been appropriated. This is probably the least likely scenario because it's an election year and no one wants to have a shutdown in an election year. The next possible scenario is that party leaders would just basically bypass the appropriations committees and craft and then ramrod a massive spending bill right before midnight of October 1. That's probably also least likely. Finally, the most likely at this point would be a continuing resolution is adopted for an undetermined yet temporary period of time that just basically continues funding at previous year levels, so we won't have a shutdown. Under that final scenario, the CR will likely just be for a few weeks to get everyone past the November midterm elections, where both parties will be able to assess to see who actually has the upper hand. But it's important to kind of put a pin in this flawed process because keep in mind, it actually does have broad ramifications. For example, IIJA, which you'll hear about in a moment, provided a significant amount of funding for new investments in a wide variety of areas. Now, a lot of the new funding was only authorized funding and not guaranteed appropriations, which means it still relies on some future congressional actions. And so if there's any delays in those future appropriations processes, that actually could result in delays of future funding distributions for IIJA programs. It may even, face potential funding reductions, especially if any deals have to be made. And so really, again, with this, that limited legislative calendar, even though there's technically a little over 5 months left on the calendar, with this August recess, with the, month of October also potentially being a wash because that's going to be right before the elections, there's just not a lot of time to really deal with the appropriations, whatever this Build Back Better bill might look like, and any of those other hot topic items I mentioned earlier. So what does that mean for public finance priorities? Well, in short, it doesn't bode well because, again, we're limited to just searching for whatever the next train is that's leaving the station. But whether we spend time and actually find that vehicle to move before the end of the year, or we start laying the groundwork for the 118th session, both time will certainly be time well spent. But I'm going to step aside now because Jaron is going to take us into what those are and what we need to talk to your members of Congress about.
Thank you, Michael. And as mentioned, I'm Jaron Brady. I am the policy analyst here with the FOC team. Next slide, please. So the first of our priorities that we are focusing on, and we put bank qualified debt first, just because we think there's a lot of potential here to get broad bipartisan support. As some of you know, there's an exception for small issuers who issue 10 million or less in taxes and bonds annually. These issuers basically get to bypass the full underwriting process to issue taxes and bonds directly to banks, especially community banks. This 10 million rate has been consistent except for one brief period of time since the 1980s. And so we know 10 million in 1980s versus 10 million today, it looks very differently in terms of what you can do with that. So we're suggesting, or we're advocating for that cap to be raised to $30 million and then to be pegged to inflation, right? Because we see that we're seeing right now, even with the IIJA, what was, $100 million last year in terms of inflation this year, things are different. So like your buying power, your purchasing power can look very different. So we're hoping to peg that to inflation to kind of get around the issue of the dollar kind of falling in value in terms of what we get out of it. And one vehicle we have for that is HR 2634. It is the LIFT Act. This bill was introduced by Terry Sewell of Alabama in April of 2021, and it has not moved out of the House and Ways Mean Committee, but it does have a lot of support amongst Democrats, but not so much amongst Republicans because there is a part of that bill that would tackle advanced refundings, which was done away with in 2017. But we're still looking for co-sponsors, and if we don't move it this year, we're gonna try again next year for sure. But we figure we need to kind of like build kind of an understanding amongst new members when they come in about what this is and how it impacts their districts and their constituents. So we'll keep you all up to date on that. Next slide, please. And in terms of advanced refunding, so as you all may recall, in the 2017 jobs and job tax bill that was passed, the ability of governments to issue tax-exempt refunding bonds was taken away, which resulted in increased costs for issuers. As you can see, savings of 3 to 8% were foregone. And we recognize that this has broad implications, right? Because as interest rates continuously rise, you might have people issuing bonds at a much higher rate than they say 4 or 5 years ago, and they don't have the ability to kind of refinance, if you will. And so that can really result in millions of more dollars being spent and costing taxpayers in areas where these bonds are being issued. And so the LIFT Act, which I mentioned before, kind of combines the advanced refunding with the bank qualified debt together to kind of make one thing. And then HR 2288, Invest in Our Communities Act, which has more support that specifically focuses exclusively on advanced refundings. And if these bills don't move, like I said, in this Congress, we will try to push them in others. But these are two of our biggest priorities that we'll continue to push forward. Next slide, please. And so, as many of you know, we have the SLFRF funding. So there was a lot of flexibility that was kind of pushed for recently. So one bill was Senate Bill 4181, basically allowing ARPA funds to be used for housing developments that had a lifeline of like 30 years in terms of the loans that were being made out to it. Just recently, Treasury actually just amended the rule to make it very um, to make it compatible with LIHTC properties. So we're very thankful that Treasury kind of like listened to our advocacy and said, "Hey, we're gonna move this forward." So we're appreciative of that and no longer need this bill to move forward. And then the next one is Senate Bill 3011. This is the State and Local Tribal and Territorial Fiscal Recovery Infrastructure and Disaster Relief Flexibility Act. Mouthful, but basically it would allow governments to use a portion of their COVID relief funds for designated infrastructure projects, such as nationally significant highway projects. So having the flexibility to kind of respond and use those funds flexibly is really a huge goal. This bill did pass the Senate, but is not yet moved in the House, so we will keep our eye on that as well. And now I will pass it back to Emily.
Awesome. Thank you, Jerron. So yes, those two bills, of course, we're always interested in trying to make sure there is some flexibility in ARPA proceeds, although we can say it needs to pass now or kind of never. We're in the middle of the spending, the covered period for spending ARPA proceeds. And so right now what we have is an expanded flexibility on LIHTC, as Jerron mentioned, that mimics the 4181. It was kind of built into ARPA rules. We're still kind of trying to ensure that that 3011, which costs Congress nothing, might have some kind of avenue for passage, because indeed it would do actually a great deal of help for those of us who are matching CDBG funds, for example, and or transportation and highway projects like the states are generally going through right now. So this is extremely prescient. This is, if you do reach out to your members of Congress, these are things that are still outstanding, especially 3011. And talking with your members of Congress in particular, getting that Senate bill and incorporating it into any House action would be the number one priority. Now, another extremely very soon topic that needs to be tackled is on the next slide. And it essentially has to do with direct pay subsidy appropriations from the United States Congress. Now, we've got a title slide. It's kind of clever, got BABS. So BABS is a shortened version of what was called Build America bonds, bonds that were direct pay subsidy bonds coined and issued during the ARRA era. So many of you may have BABS. Some of you, actually many of you may not have BABS, because it was quite a lot of interest and uptake and larger issuers to issue those BABS. Now you might say, okay, Emily, I got BABS. What do I need to pay attention to? And what we have come across, of course, with issuers who are members of GFOA, among many other public issuer participants, as you can see, there's a pretty big coalition of interest in Capitol Hill to try to start a conversation to encourage Congress to waive a pay-go sequestration, 100% sequestration effort. So let's take it back to the very beginning. Since 2013, sequestration cuts have reduced BABS payments. Those of you who have BABS, you are aware that sequestration has sort of chiseled away at the subsidy payments that would have replicated a tax-exempt rate on direct pay subsidy bonds. So those are the BABS. So sequestration has really created sort of a budgetary dilemma for those of you who have BABS. And that's been a continuing and ongoing frustration as it becomes sort of a tool for Congress to recalibrate the budget. And in doing so, they kind of chisel away at the promises that they've made to create these subsidy payments. Now, that said, those cuts, those sequestration cuts, those sequestration efforts are extended by IIJA, the recent infrastructure bill that was passed, through 2031. So we're not done with sequestration in our subsidy payments. We're still going to remain vigilant about that. Now, the most pressing issue right now with regard to those subsidy payments is actually an effort that has been built into the American Rescue Plan Act to eliminate subsidy payments to pay-go recipients across the country. Now, pay-go, you may say, I have no idea what pay-go means. Pay-go is essentially a budgetary action of Congress, and pay-go has to be waived in order for the subsidy payments to continue to be released to recipients. Now, you might say, okay, Emily, I think I understand what you're getting at. I have direct pay subsidy bonds. I expect those subsidy bonds. Yes, I understand sequestration is a part of it, but I expect those subsidy payments. In fact, I depend on those subsidy payments. Unless pay-go is waived, subsidy payments will cease at the end of this Congress. So pay-go subsidy payments, unless waived by Congress, will not be made to pay-go recipients after 2023 begins. Now, of course, Build America bonds are our myopic focus, trying to ensure that pay-go is waived so that we do continue to receive the subsidy payments. However, we have to understand we're not even the biggest challenger in this. Many other direct recipients of pay-go actually are impacted, including the hospitals, among many others. And so we have joined a much larger coalition that is talking directly with Congressman Yarmuth, the chairman of the House Budget Committee. And if your member of Congress sits on the Budget Committee, and if you'd like to talk with them about those direct pay subsidy bonds and what they have done in your community, now's the time to do it. We have a letter of support. Actually, we have a letter of support that we've drafted. We're happy to create a template for you to make that outreach. But again, this is a very quick turnaround. This is a very quick conversation. We're probably very likely going to heat up our efforts within what we call the lame duck session, or the last part of the year, to try to make sure that PAYGO is waived. And so therefore, this is, again, one of those sort of pressing issues that hopefully we're able to kind of twist and help for people to realize that it's not a political issue. It really is a partnership issue between the federal, state, and local governments. And we'll go ahead and be successful in this effort by the end of this year. But don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any other questions about this particular issue. Now, with that, speaking of any more questions, we're in the middle of IIJA, and so I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Galen.
Thank you, Emily. So, hi everyone, my name is Galen McDonald. I'm a policy associate in the Federal Liaison Center. And so first we're going to talk about what you can do during this recess with our resources. We can go to the next slide. And so here are some examples of things you can be doing. There is inviting your member on a tour of a project. This is something that could be in person or virtual. Setting up a call with a member or their staff in their district office. And you'll be able to find on the GFOA website, on the federal advocacy page, you can find links to find your senators and representatives. You can engage your delegation on social media. There's also the option to send a letter to your delegation members to ask for support on issues like bank qualified debt or advanced refunding. And like Emily mentioned, that is something we can very much assist with. There are also resources on our website to help you understand both of these and inform your letter. You can also provide materials or present to your delegation members on an initiative or project your jurisdiction is working on. And this can also include information about how advanced refunding or bank qualified debt is or would be useful to your project. You can also share information from GFOA's advocacy resources. This includes pages that talk about advanced refunding issuance, tax-exempt municipal bonds, as well as bank-qualified municipal bonds. So on the next slide, we're going to go into a bit of a refresher and update on IIJA, which is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This is also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or the BIL. So if you hear either of those, they are talking about the same thing. So first, in the legislation to deliverables process, where are we in terms of implementing IIJA? So money is flowing out, but not every program is fully operational yet. IIJA was signed into law in November, but there's still time before all programs that were created or that got additional funding under IIJA are fully operational. We want to emphasize that the guidebook for this whole process and what the funding looks like is about 400 pages long, so there is a lot of information on how the programs will be implemented, what the notice of funding opportunities look like. So we recommend looking at federal agency websites as well as looking through this guidebook to get more information. So on the next slide, we're going to start looking at some current notice of funding opportunities, or NOFOs. This is just a sampling of opportunities that we think might be of interest to you. We unfortunately can't go into everything that's in the guidebook, but if you see something in the guidebook or there's something else you are interested in that we don't talk about, please do reach out and we can help you with that. And so these are NOFOs that are open for the current round of funding, but keep in mind that some of these programs will have funding over the next 5 years that is not necessarily appropriated yet. So you can come back and look at these programs next year if you're not able to apply this year. But the first one is the Reconnecting Communities pilot program. This is funding to restore community connectivity by removing, retrofitting, or mitigating highways or other transportation facilities that create barriers to community connectivity, including to mobility, access, or economic development. So grants will be available to states, units of local governments, federally recognized tribal governments, metropolitan planning organizations, nonprofit organizations, and facility owners. So there will be approximately $195 million in current funding, $50 million towards planning grants, and $145 million to capital construction grant funds. So the applications for this program are due at 11:59 p.m. on October 13th, 2022. So there's some time before that one is due. On the next slide, we can see the Middle Mile Grants Program, which is funding for the construction, improvement, or acquisition of middle mile infrastructure. So this will be competitive grants open to states, political subdivisions, public utility districts, and regional planning councils, as well as some other entities. So there's $1 billion available for this program, and applications are due at 11:59 p.m. on September 30th, 2022. So there's also some time before that is due. On the next slide, we have the Safe Streets and Roads for All program. This is $5 billion in competitive grants to support local initiatives to prevent death and serious injury on roads and streets. You might have heard it referred to as Vision Zero or the Zero Death Initiative. This is competitive grants that are open to metropolitan planning organizations, political subdivisions of states, federally recognized tribal governments, and multi-jurisdictional group of entities described there. And this one is due at 11:59 p.m. on September 15th, 2022. So still a bit of time before that's due, but it is next month. And on the next slide, you can see some further resources that we have available, including on our website, where there is a IIJA implementation resources page, as well as a IIJA notice of funding opportunity tracker. So it's a very useful tool to see what is coming out in terms of funding. There is also the guidebook to the bipartisan infrastructure law. There is a lot of information about that in there about the different programs, where you can find more information, what agencies are implementing different programs, and how you can find funding. There's also a guidebook specifically for rural entities that should help with more information. I am going to give this back over to Michael Bellarmino. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Galen. And yes, lots and lots of information, whether it's stuff that GFOA does as far as their analysis, or sharing information, whether it's coming out of the agencies or the White House. We'll be sure to continue to do that. Now, speaking of information or sharing information, we can't help but to make sure that we make a plug for our MiniMuni. Now, for some of you, you may have participated in a MiniMuni over the past 3 years. Now, this is our conference that we put on usually in September or mostly in October, where it's going to be all things municipal market. And this is our fourth annual this year. Many of you saw in the newsletter last week that registration is open. So we encourage you to go to the MiniMuni homepage on the GFOA website to check out the information or the latest information. Now, we are currently busy working to put together yet another robust agenda for you all to hear the latest on all things related to the municipal market. Now, we are building off the success that we've had over the last 3 years, where attendees heard from market experts, economists, subject matter experts on hot topics in the muni market, federal officials, and most importantly, from your own peers. Now, fellow public officers who will provide, public finance officers who will provide invaluable insight and discussion on these matters. And so we really encourage you to sign up for that. Registration is complimentary for GFOA members, and you can earn 9 CPE credits by attending. The dates are October 19th to the 21st, and they'll all be taking place over a few hours in the afternoon. So of course you don't, you'll be able to kind of work it into your schedule. But again, we encourage you to check out the MiniMuni registration page and the website, and be sure to let us know if you have any questions. So with that, I'd like to bring Donna to the stage.
Thanks, Michael. I'm Donna Pizzino. I'm the assistant here at the FLC, and I know I'm looking forward to MiniMuni. This will be my first show at it. So all the topics that we've discussed here today are just a sampling of what we would be monitoring here in Washington during the August recess. As updates and new information become available, we will push all those out to our members. Remember, GFOA is your advocate in Washington. We pride ourselves on the strategic partnerships that we've built and maintained with other national organizations, community partnerships, and research groups. These partnerships and the relationships we have built create invaluable opportunities for you, our members, to access resources and information that might otherwise be out of reach. Everyone here at GFOA, and especially your FLC team, would like to encourage you to reach out to any one of us if you have questions or would like to discuss how we can better serve you. Emily, do you have any closing thoughts?
Thanks so much, Donna. No closing thoughts. And the last slide, what you can see is our contact information. Of course, these slides will be made available through the toolkit. So if you don't jot it down fast enough right now, you can certainly find it in our toolkit, but don't hesitate to reach out to any one of us. And if you could take down our slides, we'd love to have everyone turn back on their camera. This is your team in Washington, D.C. We're very happy to be here for you. If you ever find yourself in our nation's capital, please do stop by and say hi. Otherwise, we are available by email, by phone, and we're very happy to be at your service. Thanks so much to the team for being here today, and thanks for watching the toolkit. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.